Welcome. We are very proud at NewSpace Finance to share this discussion that already we had clearly got slightly started on about the future of NewSpace, given the uh, recent elections in America, and in particular what that means not just for America, but really for the entire world. We are poised
Can you
now
hear me?
in many ways
Yeah,
um,
but it's kind of a don't
to
need to be.
and please mute yourselves
It's more
if
about
you're
market trends in space.
yeah,
Oh,
let's see, Jerome, I'm going to mute you. Um, how do I mute all? Let's see, mute all, and then I'm going to mute all, and then Jamie and Michael and Rumi come off of mute, please. All right, sorry about that. So and so we're going to jump into this discussion really briefly. Michael, thank you for joining us. Michael Mealing is founder and lead space geek, perhaps is his title at Starbridge. He is one of the great thought leaders of new space, helped really drive the field for the last couple decades and continues to lead in different ways, both in policy and of course in investment. And Rumbi, welcome and thank you for joining us. Our own Rumi Makanga from NewSpace Finance. You're still on mute, so please come off mute, my dear lady. She has been an ecosystem lead, building ecosystems, connecting folks, and helping create the opportunity and possibility of success through investment, through advice, through strategy, and other functions in the new space economy. So thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I'm just going to share screen real quick. And I want to let everyone know that um, before we get jump in here, New Space Finance is going to be uh, holding a investor insight series, which will be a series of um, educational opportunities starting mid to late February next year. So we're going to be sharing information about how you can sign up and be part of that. It's going to be 8 hour-long sessions online, 20 or more experts in the space economy, Michael, of course, being one of them. We're going to kick that off with an investors conference where folks can network in person. That's optional. And then at the back end, a conference and innovator demo day. And really, this is geared to helping people understand how to invest and take advantage of the new space economy through case studies, lessons learned, what has worked, what hasn't, and really what understanding how to make the right bets for the future. Our focus is going to be not US, but very global. In many ways, Europe, MENA, Asia, certainly are going to have tremendous growth and opportunity coming up here in the coming decades in new space, as there is very clearly a race in different ways. And we are eager to provide this opportunity to our colleagues in the investment community. We'd love to have not only folks who are VCs, but also institutional investors, private equity, investment bank, and other folks be part of this so that they understand that this is not some sideways sector. In 1995, people thought that about the internet. And by 2005, those who hadn't jumped in and realized that the internet and e-commerce were mainstream critical investment sectors were left behind. That's what's going to happen to space. So we urge you to take advantage of this. We'll be sharing information about how you can join here shortly. So now I'm going to quit sharing and uh, go ahead and turn it over to my colleagues, Rumbi and Michael. And I'm going to go off camera, but I'm going to be around. And Rumbi, Michael, please take away, my friends.
Thank you so much. I think just as a really quick bit of housekeeping, if people have questions as we go along, just put them in the chat. And like if it's opportune to take the questions at the time, we'll sort of pause and discuss further. But I think in the main, we'll probably do most of the questions at the end. I've set up a bunch of questions for us that sort of start with a bit of an introduction, because I feel like, looking at who's on the call today, not everybody is actually, a space tech expert. So I want to start by kind of contextualizing for all of us, so we start from sort of the same footing in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about the space economy. I think the policy is going to be very interesting to a lot of people. So we'll delve into some of the shifts in US space policy and what they mean for not just the US, but the global space economy. And I'd love to kind of like round out the question set with a little bit of discussion about the future of the ecosystem. And within that, maybe touching a little bit on how Starbridge thinks about, investing in space tech, and delving into maybe a little bit about, how you've invested in the past and what you're looking at going into the future. So as a starting point, Michael, I was kind of hoping that we could set the scene on what the space economy looks like, kind of a little bit about where we've been coming from. I think so often it's seen as a bit of an isolated sector with, a small number of investors backing cool science fiction sounding innovation that doesn't really have a commercial underpinning. And, when I was at Seraphim, my introduction actually was, it was broken down into Space 1.0, which was, the government's investing in critical infrastructure in space, Space 2.0, which is sort of this privatization, so commercial players coming in and building out infrastructure within space, and Space 3.0, which I guess is more of what right now is seeming very science fiction-y, but, the in-space economy that's being built out, right? Companies building out in-space refueling, in-space manufacturing, in-space energy generation, etc. I was just hoping, you could sort of map that out for us, in terms of what the evolution of the space ecosystem has been like, and what the kind of foundation that is, that we're building on.
Sure. So going back to something that Zahir had said, I started out my career in the early internet pre-1995, actually 89, 90, before the web and even if anybody remembers, Gopher existed. So what informs my view of space is kind of watching that industry grow up from nothing as well before. And when you look at technology adoption, there's a lot of research about how that happens, S curves and chasms of death in product adoption, things like that. A lot of that informs the space sector, and we go through these hype cycles that, if you're in the bottom of one, they kind of are terrible to deal with, especially if you're trying to raise money. But if you look at the long-term trend, those hype cycles kind of stack on each other, and you get a long-term kind of secular growth trend. And I think that's a good way to look at the space sector. When I first started out in the sector, I was working at Maston Space Systems back in 2004. I helped Dave Maston form it. I was CFO and a business development guy. And back then, if you can imagine how hard it is to raise money for a rocket company now, try to do it in 2004. That was when commercial space started attempting to change things. This is when SpaceX got started. And a lot of others, and a lot of us failed, and some succeeded, and some are still around. And that was really about access to space, launch, getting things up there, which is the basics of when you're thinking about the internet, just being able to send a packet from one place to another. This was the same thing. In the early part of the last decade, you started seeing applications. And that's when you had Planet, Earth observation, some communications companies started to go. But again, it was still a limited number of companies, and it was for us, it was very difficult. It really didn't justify a venture capital fund. But what both my founder, Steven Jorgensen, and myself, and a few other people were seeing was things were starting to become investable. But what we needed was some kind of critical mass. Both Steven and I were at an ISDC in early 2017, and we were both seeing some evidence that had changed. And that was where large VC funds were trying to make investments in the space sector and really getting it wrong. There were companies that should have been able to raise an A round but couldn't. The valley of death was immediately after your seed round, because that was friends and family, and then nothing happened. But that's when Stephen and I looked and said, what we really need is a returns focused reality-based venture capital fund to go in and fix these structural problems that we were seeing. And our timing couldn't have been more perfect. I mean, our first fund, we have Axiom, Umbra, Link Global, some material sciences companies. Our first investment was Made in Space, which has now spawned off 4 different companies after that exited, and really got us into Axiom space. And so things have changed, but there is still an underlying problem that we do see, and this happens with the internet, happens with any technical industry, is technical founders pay more attention to the technology than the market. And that's where Starbridge and most VCs, honestly, will pay far more attention to what is the market capable of absorbing. You can get out ahead of your market. If anybody's read their Clayton Christensen lately, first mover advantage doesn't exist, but second mover advantage does. And what we're seeing now, especially what we saw in late 22, all of 23, and a little bit of part of this year, is interest rates went up. Venture capital and early stage technology investing dried up. And so you had a culling of the herd. Companies couldn't make it. And these do happen. Whatever the trigger is, the hype cycle gets, the balloon gets popped. And a lot of that had to do with what is viable, where do these viable businesses come from? And right now, all of the customers are on the earth. Even when you talk to folks in Space Force, their answer is, I'll get to the moon one day. I think the quote goes, I will worry about the alligator that is swimming toward me after I deal with the one that's chewing off my foot. And that's why Space Force really is low Earth orbit and GEO. And DoD is really struggling to be able to make the case for in-space refueling, for doing anything beyond GEO. And so it's very easy, and we did see this in 21 and 22, companies getting ahead of the market. And that's where a lot of the bloodbath that we've seen over the past couple of years has happened. So one of the conclusions that Starbridge has sort of come to, and other people, probably some names I see on the list here would agree, for us to get beyond low Earth orbit up to GEO, Earth observation and communications, probably a little bit of in-space manufacturing, especially pharmaceuticals and semiconductors right now. If we want to get beyond that, it's going to require large numbers of people in space to be able to be doing things, consuming things, doing goofball things. If you can find the videos online, mixed martial arts and zero gravity is absolutely hilarious. And that's what Starbridge is now trying to catalyze. And that's one of the things that I think what's going on in Washington right now may help catalyze some of that. And we can get into that a little bit later. But yeah, there's launch, there's Earth observation, communications, which are things that we've been doing since the 1960s. We're now seeing human spaceflight actually showing up a little bit earlier than we expected. We didn't look at that until the end of the decade, but now looking at what Axiom and Jared Isaacman and SpaceX are doing, that's interesting. And we're seeing biotech and semiconductor material science manufacturing. Those are the themes that we see market traction right now. So anyone looking at investing in the sector, don't get too far ahead of the market unless you have a really robust risk tolerance.
I love that. And it really ties in well with the second question, the follow-up question I had for that, which is I came across this really provoking sentiment that if we want to encourage more investment into space, we need to stop talking about space, but focus, more on the problems being solved, the customers, the outcomes being created. And I think that really tallies right with what you said around the founders being super technical. They want to talk about the technical piece. That's where they have the strength, and the job of the investors to look at, where the market lies. And, we had this discussion before where I shared with you that actually my introduction to space tech was really about like the problems that were being solved in these cool companies and what they were being able to do. I'm currently in Zimbabwe right now. I'm in Harare, Zimbabwe, and one thing that I found really interesting is that Starlink is oversubscribed here. And the reason is, yeah, here and in Lusaka. And it's really easy to see why, right? Like it's $50 a month for unlimited, uncapped internet through Starlink, but it's about $150 in Harare right now, if you're using the sort of fiber connections. I wonder if maybe you can sort of help to, and before we spoke about the example of Oros, one of your portfolio companies, but just kind of helping people get from this sort of macro level to actually understanding some of the real problems being solved by space tech companies. And I think it touches on the point you made right now about the fact that a lot of the customers are on Earth right now, that the applications are terrestrial, the solutions are terrestrial. Would you be able to just kind of help us all get on the same page in terms of understanding what it means, right, in terms of what some of these space techs are doing?
Sure. And in some circles, there's a phrase called dual use. And that really did come out of the defense market, where you had technologies that were useful for defense and for civilian use. And we use the same term, but we don't use it in the defense context. We use it in the space versus terrestrial. So technologies and businesses really that can bridge that. Developing something down here now profitably that has implications for space. And we've got several examples. Oros Apparel, OROS Apparel, if you actually go Google for them, they have a really great line of outerwear. I've got two of their jackets and a parka, and when it was in the low 20s Fahrenheit here in Bethesda recently, I was very glad to have their jackets. They licensed a polymer-based aerogel, which I did not know was a thing, from NASA about 5 or 6 years ago, and figured out how to turn that into a textile. And then they used that in clothing. Was their North Star was the ability to stand on Mount Everest with nothing but their underwear and not die. Now, I think from a thermodynamics and physics standpoint, that may not be possible, but that was their goal. And so since then, they've taken that same technology and it's now being used in spacesuit insulation. The Department of Defense is using it to replace their tent material. And now the company is building it out into a home residential insulation material. Very high R value, much more compressed, easier to install, far more durable. And so it's solving a lot of applications down here, but it's also being used in space. We have another one that does the same thing in radiation mitigation, Cosmic Shielding Corporation. They're being used down here and up in space. There's a large numbers of them, and that's down in the material science. Another company, Offworld AI, is developing fully autonomous robotic-based mining technology down here. And it has tremendous benefits for profitably using existing mines. No need to open up new ones. They can profitably go in and reprocess tailings piles. But that is the exact technology that if you wanted to mine for water on the moon or mine an asteroid, you're going to be doing that robotically, much to the authors of The Expanse would didn't fit the plot. You're going to do those things robotically, and it needs to be autonomous because of speed of light, communications issues. And so it is a lot of these cases where there are space technologies and space businesses that you can start down here that can eventually go out there. And that's really what we like to do. Now, we have some pure space plays. Axiom is building a commercial space station. Link Global is doing direct to cell phone from space communications network. And so those are where the markets are currently at. Those are real space markets. If you want to have a technology and an application now that makes money and returns on investment, that dual use kind of category is where we really find the sweet spot these days.
Amazing. And I've seen you, just a quick sort of addition on that point. I've seen you speak about some of the market and policy conditions necessary for like the expansion of human civilization into the solar system and beyond. Would you be able to speak very quickly on some of those sort of more moonshot, more like next gen opportunities, and where you think some of the commercial, I guess, feasibility will lie for some of those?
That's a good one because one of the things that, as a VC, especially with my partner, Steven, he's a recovering hedge fund manager. Apparently, we're the 12-step program for hedge fund managers wanting to get out of the business. And that's where you really get a good idea about how the macro level financial environment affects things. Back during 2019, 20, 21, and even a little bit of 22 with 0% interest rates in the US, if you wanted to get a return on your investment, it was going to be in private equity. Debt financing, the interest rates were so low that it just didn't give people the alpha that they needed out of their portfolio. And so you had a lot of moonshot things happening. And there are companies now that benefited from that period. They were able to raise the money and get to the point where they were viable. Whereas if you were trying to do it right now, or especially last year, it would have been very difficult to raise those early investment rounds because of the impact of the overall economic environment around you. So venture capital and early stage equity financing is definitely a precursor for a lot of this. But one of the things that's also necessary, and this is something that I think we're going to see in the change in the political landscape in the US, is there is a significant role for leadership. And this is why, because one of the things, if you look online, whether you're on Blue Sky or Twitter, I still call it Twitter. I love Elon, but I'm still going to call it Twitter. And there is a lot of where leadership matters and can impact a lot of things. I do remember, and this is showing my age a little bit, Al Gore talking about information superhighways in 1991 before anyone in the public knew that the internet even existed. And this is pre-web time. But what most people don't realize is after that election, the US federal government spent very little money at all on deploying the internet in the United States or anything related to it globally. Within 30 years, we went from a network that was only able to connect a few universities and research centers to something that now spans the entire planet and has, last check, about 80% of the human population connected to it. If you had told anybody in 1991 that that's what we were going to go do, they would have said, that's impossible. That's crazy. We don't know how to do that. That's 1,000 years in the future. But again, the federal government didn't actually do much post 1990. But Al Gore talking about it created an idea in the mind of the general electorate and the general population that this is something, man, the president's actually talking about this happening like soon. I should probably pay attention to this. This is not science fiction anymore. And that's one of the things that I think we have been seeing is adoption of and speculation and new businesses formed around these moonshot ideas, these things for going out beyond just communications and Earth observation, is starting to change because people are realizing that it is not science fiction. If you look at all the engineering and the research, we can actually do this. And that's becoming something that people are starting to accept. Do we know exactly how it's going to happen? No. Did we know exactly how the internet was going to get built? No. we're really, really good at making this stuff up as we go along, and that's where the opportunities are. So I actually suspect that, and I've got a piece of legislation I'm trying to shop around that it basically says that it's a joint resolution of Congress um, setting that the United States will be a first multiplanetary nation, and to that end, it will have 10,000 American citizens living and working in space by 2035, and 50,000 people living in space by 2050, with the first House and Senate members from representing the in-space population of U.S. citizens. If I had tried to do that even 3 or 4 years ago, I would have been laughed out of the room. But when I talk to House members and staffers about that, the right ones, the ones that are already a little bit crazy like the rest of us, they see that, you know what, that's actually doable. And that would actually, I mean, right now, based on how you estimate it, the internet contributes about 15 to 20% annually to US GDP. Just think of the opportunities that you could get if you had that many people and that much ambition in space, and what that would mean to global GDP when it's not just the US. You know, it's UAE, India, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Africa, you know, everybody's getting there. That's the thing that's kind of really interesting to me, is looking at how ambitious a lot of other countries are being when it looks at what actually putting people in space and doing things there. I think India is about to impress a lot of people with their human spaceflight program, as an example. So yes, those moonshots are going to start to happen. I think changes now that interest rates are back to normal in the US. I think that's going to have an effect. So yeah, these moonshots are going to happen. But again, there's a large amount of market formation, market structure, access to the customers, getting the customers to realize it's going to happen. So this is not all about engineering. There's an incredible marketing component to this that we have not been doing lately. So.
Amazing. And I think that leads on very nicely into maybe a deeper discussion in terms of, you know, how US space policy is being shaped and directed by this second Trump administration. I think there's been a bit of a carryover, right, from the policies from the first administration that carried through to the Biden administration. And, you know, it seems like there's a bit of a recognition of the need for international collaboration, right, to grow this space economy, but then also a bit of I guess, an intentional protection of American technological, economic, and national security interests. So I'm curious, you know, what direction are we heading in with the new administration, and what are the impacts going to be both for the US, right, and for everybody building space tech across the globe?
Yes, I keep glancing over at Twitter just because, you know, you never know, something could have happened in the last 10 minutes. Actually, one of the things did. Apparently, a senior NASA official in a closed door meeting, quote, said that yesterday, suggesting the Department of Government efficiency would not be such a bad thing, and that the agency could benefit from losing some of its bureaucracy. And that's coming from a senior NASA official. And so the choice of Jared Isaacman as NASA administrator, I think, is inspired. I've met him a couple of times. Just a really damn nice guy. And I think he's the right person for that role, because NASA, a lot of people, especially you know, in K through 12 education, NASA is something to aspire to. I mean, yes, it's a bureaucracy. Yes, there are ways that we wish we could fix it. But I think it's also one of the United States' most recognizable international brands. So I think Jared is perfect for that role, especially for also preserving NASA's market position, for lack of a better word, but also understanding how to go in and help change the organization. I do think that there is an appetite for significant change. And a lot of this, for anybody that's in government, there's a phrase called state capacity, which gets to can a government actually accomplish the things that it wants to do? Is its bureaucracy and its systems competent enough to be able to deliver on the tasks that is given by its electorate? And I think that one of the things you'll find there is a great deal of acceptance by both Democrats and Republicans in the US that our bureaucracy is gotten very unproductive and needs to be fixed. Getting really nerdy, the Trump administration previously created something called Schedule F, which increases the number of civil servants that are subject to being able to be fired at the will of the president, to be able to create accountability. And now you see a growing number of Democrats actually thinking that wasn't actually a bad idea. And I suspect when President-elect Trump implements Schedule F again, you would probably see that survive through to a Democratic presidency. And so things are changing. The problem is right now is a lot of that is a little bit opaque because they're going on inside transition teams. What typically happens during an administration change is there's these what they call landing teams that come in from the new president coming in to agencies to find out what's going on, where the landmine's at, what's going well, and be able to figure out when the new transition team comes in to be able to take over these agencies, what should they expect? Those are only now just starting. And in some cases, I think we may have agencies that don't even have transition teams. You may just get the new team to show up and start from day one. The Department of Government Efficiency, a lot of people have put a lot of stock into that. But I think one thing to realize is technically in law is the equivalent of a blue ribbon commission, which means it can recommend, but it has no real power. The real power is still in the presidency in terms of what it can do within the limits of the law and Congress. And the phrase that I use with the other folks that I do a bit of lobbying with is no plan survives first contact with the appropriations subcommittees, regardless of what your authorizing committees say. And that's where we're going to see some very interesting things happening. But I think you're even seeing some Democrats look at what's going on with these transitions and within limits. Like, okay, some of this stuff isn't all that bad, especially for implementing state capacity. When it comes to space, one of the things that's currently bubbling all over this city is what happens to the Artemis program. Now, for those on the call that are not from the US, the Artemis program is technically separate from the Artemis Accords. The Accords are that group of agreements that allow you to do commercial activity in space. Specifically, it gets to allowing, if you mine something from an asteroid, you can't claim the asteroid, but you get at least keep the stuff that you got off of it. But we have this situation where I think there's a general consensus that the Space Launch System, colloquially known as the Senate Launch System, is probably going to get canceled in some form. Artemis 2 will probably go ahead. But I think going forward, that program is going to see a lot of changes. What we don't know is what does that mean for when do we get back to the moon? What does it mean for Gateway, which is the space station that loops around the moon, and things like that. And so those details are still to be figured out. What's going to be interesting to see is whether or not the White House and Congress start finally acknowledging that SpaceX is going to Mars. One of the oddest things I've seen in Congress is the absolute inability of most Congress members and staffers to acknowledge that SpaceX even has that as its goal. It's been very much a blinders on, not being able to know, and unless it's a program of record with the federal government, it doesn't exist. And I think that's going to change. Because right now there is an expectation that China could actually put boots on the ground in 2028. And it's a real question about whether or not we could do that before they do. And that's a goal for a lot of people, is to be able, yes, it is a space race, and those can be productive and they can be damaging. But I think SpaceX putting boots on Mars in, I currently estimate late 2031, that would be kind of transformational for a lot of things, especially for the reasons that he's planning on going. And that's where I am looking for a lot of those conversations that I'm having with staffers and members of Congress that realize the way we've been doing things in space on a government basis has been swiftly overtaken by events. And how do they start thinking about that? I have absolutely no idea what that is right now. That's why I'm going to events all throughout the next couple of weeks, talking to members and new staffers to find out where their heads are at. And I think the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. I think the next 2 years are going to be very, very interesting. I do expect the Democrats to take the House back in the midterms of 2026, which is going to be very interesting indeed.
Amazing. There's a lot to follow on from that, but I just want to give people in the audience an opportunity to ask questions. Sarah Mitron had, I guess, a bit of a follow-up. I don't know if you want to unmute and ask the question, Sarah. I think part of it was addressed, but I just want to give you the opportunity to ask the question.
Yeah. So yeah, what I wanted, a lot of the people that have followed space are very excited about Jared being involved as a head of system administrator. I'm just wondering how much he can do, because I've seen a lot of budgets in NASA disappearing, and layoffs from JPL, and I guess a lot of commercial space stations are just nervous about not being able to support their operations without substantial investment from the government. And I wanted to hear from you if you have any perspective on that.
Sure. So full disclosure, we're an investor in Axiom, and so I pay close attention to the commercial LEO destinations program. And that's where commercial stations take over from the International Space Station, which is currently end of life, is expected in 2031, according to US law. But there is a significant threat by Russia that they could abandon the station in 2028. And since the Russian segment is primarily responsible for station reboost, that's why you're seeing NASA start looking at things at using visiting vehicles to do station reboost. But it would be very difficult to keep the ISS going without Russian involvement in the Russian segment. And they have said they have actually no intention of allowing US access to the Russian segment. So there's a big problem there. So a lot of those companies are depending on that kind of guaranteed anchor tenant status coming from the government. And that is a challenge. The other things that are going on around with NASA centers and Jared and what Jared can do, a lot of that is up in the air. I think that quote from a senior NASA staff official is kind of telling, that if you talk to anybody at the senior levels within NASA, the perceptions about what they can and cannot do, and what they may be required, they think that they are required to do. I think looking a lot at what's interesting is the appetite this incoming administration has for looking at all of those bureaucratic straitjackets that the agencies feel that they are under may be revisited. There's in a lot of the state capacity conversations, whether it's NASA or DoD or anywhere else, there is significant evidence that agencies think they are under restrictions that are not actually exist. They were created early on by interpretations of law that Congress never intended, things like that. And so if you want to read on some of that stuff, the Paperwork Reduction Act is apparently, which was written before the internet became a thing, has some serious impacts on how agencies can operate. I think that's going to help a lot of that. But where I think this is where I get back to leadership. In a lot of these cases, leadership is going to matter. Is there going to be disruption? Yes. That's the only way you get change done, is there will be disruption. I do think the CLD ISS transition is going to come to a head sooner rather than later. The down select, which is where they're reshuffling who's part of the program based on Northrop Grumman dropping out and blah blah blah. That's going to have an impact. But yeah, I agree. Now, in terms of what Jared can and can't do, it's going to be very interesting to see what role and how much power the Alabama delegation has, because the Alabama delegation, and specifically Marshall Space Flight Center and Redstone Arsenal, are where a lot of the more, I'm being generous here, a little bit old school kind of space programmatics comes from. And there are others, Stennis and Glenn and places like that. But one of the things I learned about in Congress is there are a lot of things that most people don't care about. And if you really, really do care about them, and you're willing, this is what the former senator from Alabama was really good about doing. If he didn't get the budget that he wanted for what he would shut Congress down. He had said, I'm head of appropriations, and nothing will happen in this government unless you give me exactly what I want for NASA in my district. And everyone else said, I don't care about NASA, so yeah, do whatever you want. And it's going to be interesting to see how the parochial, I suppose I could use the word pork, comes into NASA's budget, given the Republicans' thin majorities in both sides, how that's going to affect. So I really have no idea. It probably depends on how much President Trump cares and whether or not he can rein in the Alabama delegation and do some horse trading there. So that's a good question. I don't think anybody has any idea right now, but I do think Jared is going into NASA with a NASA leadership that's already there that is eager to work with them.
Amazing. Thank you, Michael. There are quite a few questions coming in for you.
Sure.
Arena asked, how does innovation in the European space sector compare to that of the American space tech sector? And in which subsegments is Europe trailing? And what can be done to accelerate European space tech development?
So we have a couple of investments in Europe, and I include UK and Europe, even though Brexit, blah, blah. Space Forge out of the UK, which is in space manufacturing of semiconductors and other materials. And Avialto, which is a high altitude platform company out of London. We're looking at making investments around Europe. But the thing that we look for is the exact same thing I look for in the US, is a company that is going after a market, not a program. Government programs can help you get started, but they should never be your primary market. Because the only way I make venture capital returns is if there's a real business there. And I think that's one of the challenges that I see in Europe is a lot of entrepreneurs are chasing programs, and I can't get behind that as an investor. I have to see the bigger picture, a commercial picture. But those do exist. I think that one of the things that is really interesting about the international market when it comes to space is the level of ambition. Namrata Goswami had a great article about a year or two ago where she analyzed all of the new national space laws that have been passed around the world, the UAE, UK, India. And the thing that she noted was, unlike the US, those laws were specifically around industrial capacity and economic development. You even in some of them, you saw almost no mention of science at all. Whereas if you compare that to the US space laws, it is all about, around NASA and everything else. It's about science and STEM and international diplomacy. That leaves me with a lot of very interesting ideas about where to invest. I do love India's ambition. The ambition from South Korea. I'm looking at for companies, regardless of where they are, although domiciliation matters because of tax policy, international policy, things like that. There are countries that are now taxing entrepreneurs' unrealized gains, and now you're getting entrepreneurial flight. Those entrepreneurs are taking their companies to other countries because they can't handle the tax rules in their country. So tax policy matters. How easy it is to just create a company in your country, I think, is one of the biggest things. Labor laws in Germany really drive entrepreneurship outside of Germany. And those kind of things matter. Is it, ambition also matters, but entrepreneurs will do what they got to do wherever they're at. But I think that's the key thing that, if somebody made me a president of Europe, I would be like, okay, and this is something I'm trying to do in the US. We have something called qualified small business stock capital gains exemptions. Yes, this is awfully nerdy. But in the US, if you invest in a company and the value of the company is less than $50 million when you do that investment, when you get your exit, you do not pay any taxes on the gain on that investment up to $100 million. I'm actually advocating for those numbers to be increased from $1 billion post-investment value and $2 billion of capital gains exemptions. And I think that's where, if I could get Europe to do something like that, and also a pan-European version of a limited liability LLC, the way Delaware does, and also don't tax unrealized gain, that would make Europe a lot more competitive.
Amazing. We have another question. Actually, just to check, Michael, before you'd said you were good to go over time if people still had questions. Is that still true?
Yeah, I don't have anything on my calendar until 4 o'clock. So if anybody wants to hang.
Amazing. Because yeah, we have quite a few questions that have just come through. The next question was from Beatrice, which is, what, in your opinion, are the top 3 industries in the space sector that may be best positioned to grow in the Trump administration and the current market/investor mood?
That's an interesting one. Okay, I guess it's kind of hard to say. I think Earth observation and communications are, I wouldn't say they're completely mature, but they're mature enough now that it would be very difficult to break into. Margins are getting squished. And in terms of investability, that's not an area that I would put a lot of money behind at this point. Oh, the analytics side of combining different Earth observation phenomenologies is still a unsolved problem. Um, the I guess it depends on what your investment horizon is and what your acceptance of risk might be, because Elon's going to Mars. Some of these things are going to happen because the investors, the private investors, are already there, and Starlink is going to give them enough money to be able to get there and go. So if you assume that's the case, then there's going to be a lot of things done at scale. There was a phrase that we came up with about 3 or 4 years ago. We called it the Starship Singularity. And I'm using singularity in the context of when technological change happens so rapidly, you cannot see beyond the event horizon of that change. You cannot predict what the future would look like in any form. You can't even understand it, much less predict it. And I think that's going to be the case with Starship. When it starts flying regularly, I think a lot of people are looking at the size of it, but I don't think they understand the commercial airline level turn time built into that vehicle and how many times they can land, refuel, fly again, and how disruptive that's going to be. So areas that take advantage of that, we support. Food production, more resort style kind of things that you would want to make living up there much more enjoyable. But you're also going to see a significant amount of in-space manufacturing, especially on pharmaceuticals. If we get to scale, the protein crystallography method of actually doing drug manufacturing, not research, this is manufacturing, that only works at Starship scale. And I think that's one of the things that I would not be surprised that within the next 5 years, you will see the first pharmaceuticals coming into standard medical procedures that are manufactured in space. So those are some of the things that I expect to see. But I really do look forward to being surprised, somebody coming out of left field with something. Even if I'm not an investor, that's the kind of thing that gets you to a very interesting, sustainable ecosystem, is when you start not being able to predict what's going to happen.
Thank you so much. We've had quite a few questions. I think let's maybe extend for another 15 minutes or so.
Sure.
But before we do so, because we're at exactly time that we're supposed to end, I wondered, Michael, if you could just give us like a closing word for everybody who needs to drop off right now, and then we can
Sure.
sort of stay and take a few more questions.
Yep. I think if you are in this sector or you're interested in it, you're going to be spending a lot of time just trying to keep track of what's going on. I would actually recommend finding a couple of good newsletters. Space News from is a good one. There's a guy named I'm blanking on JTAN Space out of India, gives you a good idea what's going on in Southeast Asia. Find some of those good newsletters to help you keep track of what's going on. Mainstream media does not understand this stuff at all, so you're gonna just don't even bother with that. The conclusions are that things are about to change. The question is whether or not if you want to get through it and accomplish something, keep your head on straight. Do not fall for hype. One of the things that has gotten us in trouble is listening to space agencies talk about things that no one has funded them to do. So there were a lot of companies that created around lunar surface development when there was very little to no funding from Congress for that. And so you have a lot of the commercial lunar payload services companies, CLPS companies, really struggling to find customers when NASA couldn't. One of the things they really wanted NASA to do was do a block buy, because they could plan that way, like 5 missions in a block. Those things are going to be very difficult. But if you have the risk profile to do it, and you find somebody that has a good plan, and a steady supply of funding, you can be in some of those early SpaceX's and Axioms and Umbras and people like that. And Vast is an interesting one, but they're self-funded. They may be raising a round sometime soon, but it's going to be at a very high valuation. So pay attention, talk with others, because things are going to be moving very, very fast. And I'm sure whatever I tell you right now will probably be wrong tomorrow afternoon. Yeah, make friends with all the other people on the call and network like crazy. This is going to be fun and terrifying at the same time.
Thank you so much for that closing word. I think just a very quick closing word from myself. And then what I'm going to do for the rest of the questions is I'm not going to read them out, just going to ask people to raise their hands and just unmute and ask the questions, because we won't know who's still on the call, who had put questions in the chat already. But just from our side, from the NewSpace Finance side, I mean, thank you so much to everybody for attending. Please do stay in touch with us. Please follow us on LinkedIn. We'll be having more of these investor webinars. We'll have more of these discussions, so please follow our LinkedIn, NewSpace Finance, to stay in touch. Please also follow Starbridge and Michael to stay updated to all the work that they'll be doing. And also, if anybody is interested in the investor education series, then please do reach out to us. But yeah, no, thank you all so much. This has been really, really great. Really great, engaging questions. Please, as Michael said, please also do connect with each other. I think there's a really great community that has already emerged from this conversation. But without further ado, thank you so much, Bidushi, for kicking us off. Please do unmute and ask your question.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry, I've got limited bandwidth today. So thank you very much for the presentation. This is super interesting because we know we're coming up on super exciting times here. My question is about who's going to pay for debris mitigation and characterization in the coming years, because everybody thinks it's a great idea. There are a lot of companies working on this, but it's not clear to me who's actually going to put out the money to pay for this service. Thanks.
Yeah. Sure. It's an interesting question because stock markets generally don't find waste management companies to be interesting from a financial standpoint. There are a couple that have done it because they've gotten outside of that, because generally waste management is a tragedy of the commons kind of a problem, and therefore it ends up being paid for by your local government or your national government. And taxpayers generally don't like it when their garbage company makes 80 to 90% profit margins. And so you get, from an investability standpoint, both space situational awareness and space debris mitigation are almost quasi-commons kind of businesses. And so they're not going to make venture capital kind of returns on them. So when we look at it, so there's a couple of things. Debris mitigation is important in some very specific orbits. There are other orbits that are just not valuable. So it depends on where you're at. For example, there's a lot of debris in old Soviet Molniya orbits, but generally Russia is the only country that used those. And so they do pose a little bit of a problem, but it's far more easily navigable to get around them. So not all orbits are created equal. There are some that are a lot more crowded than others. And so the question becomes, what needs to be done now rather than trying to boil space and remove all of the debris, especially when the vast majority of the debris that is out there belongs to either Russia or China. And both have said that if you touch our stuff, even if it's junk, we're going to be incredibly upset about that. Russia even said they would consider that to be an act of war, although they say that a lot about things lately. So it's going to be a difficult one. I think the key thing to focus on to get both SSA has a lot of navigability issues as well, because if you want to go somewhere in a rocket, you have to thread the needle of all the things that are up there, debris and active satellites. That's actually more of a problem, is not debris. It's the proliferation of LEO. Things are just crowded up there, and this is not debris. These are active satellites. They can move around, and that's where a lot of how we're solving these problems. There's one company that I do find kind of fascinating, is from an SSA and maneuverability question. They're actually providing you with debris mitigation as a service. So you turn over control of your spacecraft to them, and they will move you out of the way for you, because they have the data, and instead of getting the delay of having to get in touch with the spacecraft owner, getting them to uplink, data to the satellite, the next pass, blah, 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 they've got that infrastructure and they handle it for you. And a lot of companies are willing to pay pretty high amounts of money for that as a service because of the risk mitigation aspects. So I think if we get creative, there are ways to deal with this that don't get into a pure government provided service of debris mitigation and removal. I do get a lot of companies trying to talk about recycling in space, but I really cannot figure out how to close that from a physics monetary standpoint. That one's difficult to do because it's too easy to launch a new spacecraft. Trying to build a spacecraft in space, no, not going to happen anytime soon.
Hey,
So
Michael,
sorry, I just don't have a really good straight answer for you.
Thank you for what a great conversation. I asked a question quite a bit back, and I just wanted to get your thought on the decadal survey. And are you using that as sort of a way to look at investment down into the next 10 years?
The decadal surveys in the sense of the science astronomy side from the national academies.
Yeah, all of our priorities and how obviously how that might play out. We know obviously depending on how they decide to parse out the buckets, but from your seat as with the money side of it, do you guys look at that, and if you do, how do you kind of process that for longer term investment?
To be honest with you, the only part of the decadal surveys I pay attention to is sensor development on certain spacecraft to see whether or not that has implications for Earth observation businesses that we're investors in. The decadal surveys are science driven, and we're really focused on industrialization and economic development. That said, the decadal survey aspect, I'm actually advocating that. So in the navel gazing that we're all doing, one of the things that I'm suggesting is that the science and technology, the space and technology mission director, STMD, actually be moved over into the aeronautical side of NASA, and both of them moved over into NIST, specifically as applied industrial technology development. Now, this STMD inside NIST would still have a science component, but I would like to do not a decadal, but a 5-year turn where industry comes to STMD and says, this is the fundamental engineering and flight and whatever research that we as an industry can't afford to do or can't agree on. Can you do it for us? Which is getting back to the old NACA model before NASA was created, and the way the aeronautical side of things works. I think that's very valuable, and something I think would help the industry tremendously. But in terms of our investment thesis, honestly, talking to some of the other investors, and if there are other investors on the call, please pipe up. I really don't pay much attention to the decadal surveys from a finance standpoint. Sorry.
No, appreciate the answer.
Amazing. Maybe we just take one last question if there is an outstanding question in the room.
Yeah, Michael, I've got one for you.
Mm-hmm.
I can put my video on. It must be harder to identify investments now, or is it harder now that SpaceX has such a reinforced dominance in the industry under the new administration? Often when we're talking to companies, we hear founders slightly sweating at how they're going to compete and are uncertain, what SpaceX will do next. And when we talk to investors, sometimes you hear the question, well, if it's such a good idea, A, why isn't SpaceX doing it? And B, if they are going to do it, how are you going to compete? Is it going to be much harder for you, or do you think it's going to be easier given the changes you expect?
I would combine those two and say it's just going to be very different. One of the things that we have been seeing even over the past year is, and this is something that I've seen going all the way back to before and after the dot-com bubble popped out, outside of the space sector. Investors were trained by the internet and the ability to scale fast, with the idea that you could make a seed level investment and get an exit out in 4 or 5 years because that you could scale on the internet so fast. But I think reality has come back and said that because that's all software and the internet already exists. If you're an emerging market, you're not going to get an exit until you get to the traditional pre-internet VC exit horizons of 8 to 12 years. And the multiples you're going to expect, there's a maximum, VCs want 10x. Well, no, actually, I want more than that because I expect to get an exit in year. In order for somebody to buy that company from me and get that exit, they have to realize a return on that investment. And it's usually in the same kind of time horizon. So I don't look at what's going on right now at all. And I got to be aware of market conditions when I look for an exit. But I really want to know what's going on 16 years from now to be able to understand what the appetite is going to be. And that's the hard thing. That's where we spent so much time on the integrated space plan. And I'll send out the link to that. We haven't updated it since 2020, so it's really out of date. Please don't buy one. I think the thing we are seeing right now is the internet. One of the things that enabled you to do was sell small pieces of things, and you could put them together easily. So you could go from, a $20,000 bootstrap to selling your startup for 30, 40 million, and everybody's happy. Hardware doesn't let you do that. And so I think what you're going to start seeing is capital networks like the PayPal Mafia or these other cases where you have a group of investors that all know each other and understand their thesis and understand their risk profile are going to go in and fund a company at least until it's A round, and that A round is going to be, that valuation is going to be in the 300 million plus. And so the checks that you have to write are going to get larger if you want to participate. So in that sense, it's not so much that you're going to be frozen out because SpaceX is going into the into your market. I don't think they are. SpaceX does not. Now we have, okay, this is interesting because we have Europeans on the call and we have US people. US has a slightly different view of antitrust. In the US, a natural monopoly is allowed to exist. In Europe, in most European countries, that's not the case. Even if you are a monopoly and accidentally a monopoly, you will get broken up. And so that's an interesting thing. But Gwen Shotwell is not going to let Elon do anything that will cause SpaceX to run afoul of US antitrust law. As you see right now with DOJ and Google, DOJ is if they find evidence of anti-competitive practices, they will come in. And I don't think the Trump administration is going to prevent that. Donald Trump has a very dim view of some of these things, as we can see with his definition of big tech, basically Facebook and Google. And so I don't think it's going to be that SpaceX is going to get into your business. That said, they are already in several businesses other than launch. And I think you can look clearly at what Elon finds interesting, what SpaceX finds interesting, and what they don't. I do not see SpaceX getting into in-space manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. They will provide starships for people, but they don't want to understand the pharmaceutical business. And there are established players out there that are larger than they are, and they can push them out. So go where the puck isn't in that case. If SpaceX is the hockey player and he's about to hit the puck, don't go where he's going to hit the puck. Man, I'm really torturing that analogy, but yeah. And so, be your own hockey player, find another puck and hit it where you want to go. But your capital raise requirements are going to be significant. This stuff is not cheap. The opportunity is tremendous, but just look at SpaceX's history. Depending on what they're spending in a given moment on Starlink deployment, they're either profitable or marginally profitable, and it took them this long. Look at Anduril. Look at Peter Thiel's company. I'm blanking on the name of. They all stay private longer, and they put off generating profit far into the future. Growth is far more important than profitability. You can figure out profitability later as long as you actually have significant margins and a large enough market. So growth and speed are going to be the thing that wins, not finding a niche and getting there before SpaceX does.
Peter Thiel's case, that's true of a software company. I think Palantir was going 17 years before it listed and still wasn't profitable.
Correct.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
Yes, Gwen. Yes, Sarah. Gwen is awesome and is one of the most competent executives I have ever met. So, but yeah, this has been great. Great questions from everybody. I'm easily findable on LinkedIn or wherever you can find me. If you want to see me spew about space policy and random stuff, find me on Twitter. I don't care what Elon calls it. I'm still going to call it Twitter. And I am, except for my mom, I'm probably one of the only 2L Mealings on the internet, so I'm pretty easy to find.
I think the evidence is that people do want to hear you spew about space policy. So I think you'll be gaining a new audience, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, if anybody has any other questions directly, just find me and ask. I probably don't know the answer, but I will try not to make stuff up.
Well, it's felt short to me, Michael. We'll check demand, but I suspect we might be asking you to come back in the new year.
Great.
I'll hand over to you to finish up.
I would definitely, if we're going to do that after the inauguration, after the first few days of the inauguration, because we have no idea what's going to happen on day one.
Yeah.
I think we should bring Michael back for like a pre and post.
Sure.
But no, thank you so much. This has been a great session. I mean, I enjoyed it. I think everybody's feedback is that this was a fantastic session. So thank you so much for your time, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Great talking to you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Ramby.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.